My brothers and sisters, the day Israel struck Qatar, I picked up my phone and called Netanyahu directly. Your aircraft crossed a line, I told him. Africa will not stay silent. When Tel Aviv calculated their operation on Doha, they never calculated on Burkina Faso's fury. When Netanyahu thought he could target a sovereign nation without consequences, he forgot that Africa no longer bows to Western protected powers. Within 6 hours of my condemnation, the Israeli ambassador requested emergency meetings. Within 12 hours, Netanyahu's office was calling African Union headquarters. Within 24 hours, defense contractors were panicking about losing African partnerships worth billions. This is not just about Qatar. This is about the moment Africa decided that sovereignty matters everywhere, and those who violate it must face consequences regardless of their American protection. My brothers and sisters, at 3:47 a.m. Doha time, Israeli F-35 jets violated Qatari airspace and launched precision strikes on sovereign territory. No warning, no provocation, no justification beyond Netanyahu's paranoia. They claimed counterterrorism. They said preemptive defense. They wrapped naked violation in security language as powerful nations always do. But Qatar is not Gaza. Qatar is not occupied territory. Qatar is a sovereign nation with embassies, international law protection, and the right to exist without Israeli strikes. When I saw smoke over Doha's skyline, I saw Ouagadougou. When I watched Qatari families fleeing, I saw African families. When I heard Netanyahu justify targeting another nation's capital, I knew silence meant complicity. I called my cabinet at 4 a.m. Prepare our strongest condemnation. Africa speaks today. Where Biden offered concerns, I offered condemnation. Where Europe gave diplomatic solutions, I gave consequences. Where traditional allies protected Netanyahu, I exposed him. Burkina Faso condemns Israel's unprovoked action against Qatar, I announced from the presidential palace. No nation targets another nation's capital and expects African silence, but words without action are powerless. I immediately suspended all military cooperation with Israel. Training programs canceled, defense contracts terminated, intelligence sharing ended. The Israeli ambassador called within 2 hours. Mr. President, this is a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, I replied, is Netanyahu thinking Africa won't defend sovereignty. Within hours, Tel Aviv realized their miscalculation. African nations control strategic minerals, oil reserves, and voting power in international forums. Losing African support meant isolation. Netanyahu personally called 3 African presidents that day. Ghana's leader hung up. Nigeria's president refused the call. Kenya's leader listened for 30 seconds before disconnecting. The Israeli Foreign Ministry dispatched emergency delegations to Cairo, Abuja, and Nairobi. Defense contractors started calculating losses from canceled African contracts. AIPAC began panic lobbying in Washington. How did we not anticipate African reaction? Netanyahu asked his advisors in leaked recordings. They had no answer because they never considered African sovereignty mattered. My condemnation triggered a continental awakening. Within 24 hours, 15 African leaders issued similar statements. Within 48 hours, the African Union called emergency sessions. Within 72 hours, African ambassadors were recalled from Tel Aviv. South Africa suspended diplomatic relations. Algeria closed airspace to Israeli flights. Morocco canceled agricultural partnerships. Nigeria terminated defense contracts. Israel suddenly faced what they feared most: consequences for their actions from nations they couldn't intimidate or control. This is unprecedented, Israeli analysts admitted on television. They were right. For the first time, Israel faced coordinated African diplomatic retaliation. Why did I defend Qatar so strongly? Because Qatar invested in Africa when others ignored us. Qatari sovereign funds built hospitals in Burkina Faso. Qatari companies developed infrastructure across the Sahel. Qatari diplomats treated African leaders as equals. When someone targets your friend, you defend your friend. When someone attacks your partner, you protect your partner. Qatar stood with Africa. Africa stands with Qatar. Israel never understood this logic because they never built genuine partnerships in Africa. They offered military training and surveillance technology in exchange for diplomatic support, transactional relationships without mutual respect. Within days, Washington began pressuring African leaders to moderate their response. State Department officials called African capitals. CIA liaison visited presidents. Economic threats disguised as concerns filled diplomatic cables. Burkina Faso's reaction is destabilizing regional security. The U.S. ambassador told me during an emergency meeting, Israel targeting Qatar destabilized regional security. I replied, we're just responding to destabilization with consequences. American pressure only strengthened African resolve. When the hegemon defends the violator, the victims must stand together. Realizing their miscalculation, Israel launched desperate diplomatic campaigns across Africa. Emergency aid packages offered, new partnership proposals presented, historical friendship emphasized. Too little, too late. You cannot target nations on Monday and expect friendship on Tuesday. Israeli Defense Minister Gallant flew personally to 3 African capitals. Presidents refused meetings. Foreign ministers declined appointments. Even airport officials limited his diplomatic privileges. We never intended to harm Israel-Africa relations, Gallant pleaded to African media, but intentions matter less than actions, and actions have consequences. My condemnation sent shockwaves beyond Africa. Arab nations, seeing African support for Qatar, strengthened their own responses. Asian countries reconsidered their silence. Latin American leaders issued similar condemnations. Israel's assumption of consequence-free action crumbled. When Africa leads on sovereignty, the world follows. Regional powers like Turkey and Iran praised African leadership. Africa shows the world how sovereignty should be defended, Thran's foreign minister declared. The Qatar strike was supposed to demonstrate Israeli strength and deter enemies. Instead, it exposed Israeli weakness and created new adversaries. Losing African support meant losing crucial UN votes, mineral access, and diplomatic cover. Israeli companies faced canceled contracts worth billions. Israeli diplomats encountered closed doors across 3 continents. We underestimated African reaction, Netanyahu admitted in private meetings. We treated them like irrelevant observers instead of sovereign equals. Strategic miscalculation with generational consequences. Israel gained nothing from targeting Qatar but lost decades of African relationship building. My brothers and sisters, this moment proved Africa's diplomatic power when we stand united. Israel, backed by America's military and Europe's silence, still faced consequences when Africa said enough. We showed the world that sovereignty is non-negotiable, that violations have costs, that powerful nations face resistance regardless of their protectors. Qatar called to thank Burkina Faso for our leadership. Arab League invited me to address their emergency session. Non-aligned nations requested African guidance on sovereignty defense. Africa's moral authority grew stronger while Israel's international standing weakened. This is not just about Israel and Qatar. This is about establishing consequences for any nation that targets sovereign states without justification. Russia learned this lesson in Ukraine. America learned this lesson in Iraq. Now Israel learns this lesson with Qatar. Powerful nations cannot act with impunity when the global South stands together. Africa's condemnation carries weight because Africa represents 54 nations, 1.4 billion people, and vast natural resources. We sent a clear message: target our partners, face our opposition. Close your eyes and imagine Africa's diplomatic future. When powers calculate their actions, they must consider African responses. When nations plan operations, they must prepare for African consequences. We are no longer silent observers of international affairs. We are active defenders of sovereignty, justice, and international law. My brothers and sisters, when Netanyahu watches African presidents condemn Israeli actions at the United Nations, he will understand what Africa teaches all powers. Actions have consequences and friends have defenders. Israel targeted Qatar thinking Africa wouldn't care. They were wrong. We cared enough to act, speak, and stand for principles over politics. The world is watching Africa lead on sovereignty. They're learning that moral authority matters more than military power. They're discovering that justice eventually finds its voice. Today, Africa's voice said enough to Israeli violations. Tomorrow, that same voice will defend sovereignty wherever it's threatened.